Now it's time to update my potting bench. You remember the potting bench, right? Up here in the corner is the link to the potting bench, and I will include it in the description. I was recently looking at the potting bench with the crap piled up around it and on top of it and decided it needs a shelf. With the shelf I can take the stuff piled on top of the bench and put it down below, but we all know I will just end up piling more crap on top. First thing I need to do is to get the shop ready. I'm in the middle of my shredder conversion project, but waiting for parts on that. I've moved most of the parts for that project over here to the other side of the bench. The first thing I will have to do is pull down my folding workbench that you can see here out of the way up on the wall, but first, a quick look outside at the potting bench. A quick trip around the corner outside the door and we can see the potting bench where I want to add the shelf underneath. Here's my potting bench with all the stuff piled around, zooming in underneath to where I want to put the shelf. Here's what the shelf will look like in the 3D modeling world of Inventor. The shelf brackets will be sitting on the ledge of the potting bench feet, and I plan to have some loose pins on each side that align the shelf to the brackets. Now to get my workbench down, but first getting the table saw out of the way so there's clearance for it. First thing is to pivot the two locking tabs on top out of the way and down it comes. Then I have to go underneath and unlatch the front legs before lifting it up into position, and now we're ready to get some work done. A quick review of the forms for the shelf brackets, and we have a base, 4 sides, and a center plug. Also we'll have 2 coves up in the corners to round off the edge and a couple of plugs in the bottom corners, forming where it will sit on the feet of the potting bench. A couple of holes in the top edge for locating the loose pins that will link everything together. Now let's get into making some sawdust. Here is the board I'm going to use and the plans for cutting the parts for the forms. The first one has the dimensions for all of the sides and the other one is the form base. I will be building 2 of these, one for each side. To avoid errors, I always have my prints in front of me and double check my measurements, then label the parts as they come off the saw. Now I have all the pieces ripped and it's time to get out the crosscut sled. I think I need to get one of those adhesive back rules to make these measurements much easier. And the truth is, I paused narrating this video right now to go find one. Now the cross-cutting is complete and a quick fit up to make sure everything's correct, but I still have to cut a taper on the 2 ends. Before I cut the tapers on the ends, I need to get it all screwed together. Alignment is not overly critical, and all I need to do is make sure the bottoms are flush and the top and bottom is flush to the sides. Remember, this is only a concrete form and not a piece of furniture. All I use is a small hammer and an alignment block. I set my edge marking tool using a piece of scrap to find the center, then I mark each side and drill pilot holes. After drilling a pilot hole, I then enlarge the hole for the shank of the screw. Sometimes I might run into voids in the plywood, and in that case I would end up drilling that area out, then installing a dowel and drill again. I screw each side in one at a time, validating that they are aligned properly as well as marking the orientation of the sides. Now everything is screwed together and I grab a straight edge to mark the taper and will cut that on the bandsaw. I don't have a taper jig, so I will be cutting the end tapers freehand on the bandsaw. To be sure they're both the same, I clamp them together and then clean up the cut edges on the bench sander. Reassemble and confirm everything is where it's supposed to be. I was going to use this one form to make both brackets, but after thinking about it, I decided to make another form so I can cast them both at the same time, since they will need to stay in the forms for about 1 week. The design of the shelf brackets has rounded corners and notches where the brackets fit in between the potting bench feet. I am making the plugs on my 3D printer, and here it is, feverishly working to get those completed. On the bed in the front are the 2 coves for the rounded corners that have already been done, and it is working on the plugs for the notches. As you can see, the inside of a 3D printed part is not solid. While the printer is working on those plugs, it is time to start making the round center plug. I was also going to print that on the 3D printer, but it was estimated at a 16-hour print job, so I decided to make it out of wood. I will have to laminate 3 boards together to get to the 1.5 inch thickness. I will also have to cut in a taper. I did not want to wait for wood glue to set up before machining it, so I decided to use a spray-on contact adhesive to laminate the boards together. As with any adhesive, it's wise to use some clamping force to ensure things get stuck together. Now I will need to trim it to a square block and then find the center for the circle cutting jig. Then I will need to make another. To find the center of a square or rectangular block, just connect the 4 corners with a line. I will use this center cross to locate the hub for my circle cutting jig, as well as the mounting screw. And now here are the 2 blocks with the center crosshatch. Even though my circle cutting jig does not require a center pivot hole, I still need one to attach it to the form base. I use an automatic center punch to make sure the drill bit does not walk off center, then it's off to the drill press. When drilling small holes, I frequently back out the drill to make sure the wood chips are cleared, or the drill bit could get seized in the hole. And now for the scariest thing I do on the table saw. I need to resaw these blocks down to 1.5 inch thick. The 10-inch blade is not big enough to do the whole thing, so I will have to do the 4 sides and break off the scrap. We're going to make a couple of passes on each side. The cutoff peeled off easier than I thought it would, and grabbing a chisel cleaned up nicely, but I will run it over on the bench sander anyway. Now I need to cut that taper. I printed the edge view of the taper and using a glue stick pasted them on both ends of the block. I do this on a piece of glass because the excess glue is much easier to clean up with just a bit of acetone. Unfortunately, I lost the video where I put it on the table saw to cut as much of the taper as possible. I also put a series of cross cuts at varying depths to match the taper, and now I will take a chisel to knock some of that out, and then we'll finish it up on the bench sander. This seemed to work out pretty well. There we go, did some cross cuts. I remove material until most of the grooves cut on the table saw are gone, as well as matching the taper pattern, and now it is time to cut them into a circle. Here's my circle jig mounted on the bandsaw. Up here in the corner is a link to my video building the circle jig, and I will also include a link in the description. Before cutting it into a circle, I grab a square and mark the center line, which will be used when lining up the finished plug onto the form. Now, it is time to attach the pivot ring to the workpiece. The pivot ring has a groove in the 4 quadrants, which is used to locate it on the center mark on the board. Just match them up with the lines. It's held in place with double-sided tape. With this jig, I can cut circles without having to drill a hole in the middle. Now locating the round plug in the form and carefully measuring from the top and centering it left to right. Then match drill the mounting hole through the base, then enlarge the hole in the plug for the shank of the screw. When I installed the screw, I found out it was too long and will have to add a couple of spacers to the base. If you watched the segment about the design, you should remember that there are 4 locating pins that mate the shelf to the brackets, and now it's time to drill those holes. I used the 3D printer to create a drill jig and will line it up against the inside edge of the sides and then drill the holes. Putting a ruler up against the side, I mark the edge for alignment. Zooming in to show that we need to be aware there is an offset due to the thickness of the pencil lead. I again place the pencil on the mark, pushing the jig to the pencil, which will account for that offset. Drill the hole and then repeat for the other end, and then the same for the other form. Note that a plastic drill guide will wear out very fast. If I were drilling more holes, I would have created the guide to have a metal insert. All the boards are cut for the two bracket forms, and now it is time to put on a release agent so that the concrete does not stick to the forms. For small forms like this, I like to use boxing tape, which has zero adhesion to concrete. A few layers of overlapping strips over the base. If any wrinkles show up, I just peel it up and smooth it out, then trim all the edges with a sharp knife. And then, of course, doing the same thing on all of the sides. I also apply some tape to the top edges so that they are waterproof to inhibit delaminating of the plywood. Now that it is all sealed up, and assembling it to see what it looks like. Over to the right, you can see where I added extra thickness for the locating pins. I did this to help ensure that they are straight when the concrete is cast. I'm using my small electric screwdriver to avoid stripping out the screw holes. When mounting the center plug, I use a square and visually align the center line I marked on the plug. I drilled the holes for the locating pins a bit undersized to make sure that they are firmly held in place, so I use a medium-sized C-clamp to press them in. Now I think everything's ready and it's time for final assembly before casting the concrete. I will be using double-sided tape to attach the plastic 3D printed plugs. Since I will be casting the concrete on this bench, I need to seal up all the sides to prevent it from leaking, and for this I use a small bead of latex caulking compound. I use a wet rag to wipe off any of the excess latex. Learning as I go, I found that it would be much easier to assemble the ends first and then the top and bottom. Now I have to wait a while to let any dampness dry off before sticking on the coves and the bottom plugs. This is the end of part 1. In part 2 I will be mixing and casting the concrete into the forms. Be sure to subscribe to be notified when new content is uploaded.